different pieces of it, then you can piece together the rest of it. So the first thing is you need to realize that we need hemoglobin, right? We die if we don't have hemoglobin. If our hemoglobin is not enough iron or not enough of the protein spots, and we die. We need to have hemoglobin. So it's pretty easy to understand that we need the oxygen to attach to the hemoglobin, right? That's what hemoglobin does. But another part of that, and I think, EMTs know that, right? We learned that as EMTs, that you need red blood cells have hemoglobin, you need red blood cells to carry oxygen. So what also has to be part of the deal though, is the oxygen has to jump off at the right time, right? We don't want oxygen to stay on the hemoglobin, go all the way out to the tissue, stay on the hemoglobin, or like I very often say, stay on the bus, and then go back to the heart, go back to the lungs, go back to the body, and just stay on there. We can't have that either. So we need to have the oxygen to have an attraction or an affinity for the hemoglobin, for them to have an affinity for each other. And then in some environments, not have an affinity for each other. Want the oxygen to jump off. So one thing that I usually start off by saying is, you see how they have this S-shaped thing? The reason for that is if there was an O2 on, then an O2 is going to be O2 off, then an O2 is going to jump on. The fact, and what gives us this thing, is when oxygen jumps on, 1, 2, 3, 4 jump on. The hemoglobin looks even better when there's one hemoglobin, and 3 more will jump right on. That each hemoglobin has 4 sites that it can hold on to an oxygen. Every red blood cell has like 1 million hemoglobin, right? More than 1 million hemoglobin. So, but what gives us this S-shaped is the idea that once 1 jumps on, 4 jump on, one jumps off, 4 total jump off, all right? So when we put that hemoglobin with oxygen into an environment with high CO2, this equals a decreased affinity. So one of the first things that I want you to remember then is where we have high CO2, we'll have decreased affinity. The opposite is true also. Where we have low CO2, we'll have an increased affinity. So when we're in our lungs, we just got oxygen on, we just breathed off CO2, so it's a low area. We're in the arterial blood side, going back to the left side of the heart. That's where CO2 is at the lowest, and the oxygen has the greatest affinity for hemoglobin, the pales, all right? And then it goes out to the tissue. And in some places then, your tissue will have high CO2. In that area, this is axiomatic with our physiology, it's just the way God made us, is when we have high CO2, that also equals low oxygen, and the opposite is true. Where we have high oxygen, and this is physiology, not pathophysiology, physiology, just a regular old A&P, where we have high oxygen, we'll have low CO2, and the opposite is true. Just what's on the board is true, all right? So one more little piece of the pie. So we know this is true, we know this is true. This is good for us because we have hemoglobin decreasing affinity right where we want oxygen to jump off. And then the other thing is CO2, let's go with increased CO2, will equal, you guys are gonna finish this one. Vaso what? Vasodilation or vasoconstriction? Any guesses?
Constriction. Dilation.
Dilation and constriction? Which one?
Pick one and be confident.
Just say it fast.
Dilation.
All right, there you go. Vasodilation.
CO2 is high, oxygen is low.
So without our nervous system, without our renal system, without anything, what happens in us and in mammals, all right, is when we have, and just think, remember, we're just talking physiology, so normal, all right? We're on the high side of normal for carbon dioxide, the vessel will dilate, all right? It's just the way it is. It's just the environment. You don't need a nervous system. You don't need anything else. You have high CO2, your vessels are going to dilate. When you have low CO2, and what else is true about low CO2 is you're well oxygenated, right? High CO2 is low, so low CO2 is high. So where you are well oxygenated, your vessels will constrict. Well oxygenated is the same as having low CO2, right? High CO2 is vasodilation, low CO2 is vasoconstriction. So I'm talking about this tissue right here. It's well oxygenated. Well oxygenated means low CO2, vasoconstrict. We vasoconstrict and less blood is going there, but metabolism is still happening, and a byproduct of metabolism is hydrogen and CO2. So as this area is getting less blood flow, not no blood flow, but less blood flow, there will be a slow increase in the amount of CO2. CO2 will cause vasodilation. Where we have that increase of CO2, we now have had metabolism, so we ate up our oxygen, so we'll have low O2, we'll vasodilate, blood will go back to that area right when we need it. And this area will have a higher CO2, decreased affinity, oxygen will jump off where it needs to jump off. All of that just works. It's just the way that our Maker made us, all right? You don't need to have a brain to have it happen. You don't need a renal system. You don't need hormones. You don't need anything for that to occur. So that's just the physiology. If you know these three things, where there's high CO2, there's low oxygen. Where there's high CO2, there's decreased affinity. Where there's high CO2, you'll get vasodilation. When you just boom, 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 you understand those things, and you can kind of like, oh yeah, it kind of makes sense. That's what, if you go to I think probably a semester of microbiology, that's what you learn. That, we don't have to learn all the little enzymes and hormones and things of that sort. We just need to know these big factoids, all right? And so that's physiology. So when we start to talk about pathophysiology, if we know the physiology, here, when we talk about a right shift and a left shift, a right shift is decreased affinity. All right, so you have decreased affinity when you have a rightward shift. Well, what causes a rightward shift? When you have increased CO2, so all of your respiratory problems or things that cause respiratory acidosis, increased CO2, you're going to have a rightward shift of your oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Here you see that up arrow for CO2. It's an up arrow for hydrogen. All right, so it's up arrow for everything that we need to know. And then an up arrow for temperature. So hyperthermia for like a heat stroke or, like whatever, bad fever. And high hydrogen, which is the same as low pH. Try not to think about pH because it's easy to just say the arrows go up. All the arrows go up, and we don't care about these things. All right, so high PCO2, which is the same as PaCO2, it's the partial pressure of CO2, so little gas bubbles in your vessels, and that's from not being able to breathe them off. Acidosis, which is high hydrogen, high temperature. All of those cause a rightward shift, and what a rightward shift means then is you have a low affinity. So the oxygen that your hemoglobin isn't acting the way your hemoglobin is supposed to. So that will, that will drop your pulse oximetry. We see that. It's easy to see that when we're talking about shock patients who are now in a little bit of acidosis because of lactic acidosis. And then on the opposite side, so it's kind of easy to remember that. All right, and then we just have to go with the opposites for a leftward shift, and that's too cold, alkalosis, and then the other one is this drop in CO2, which really for us, that's going to probably be a long-term hyperventilation, somebody up in the mountains, right, 8,000, 12,000 feet. So, but for us as paramedic, really our candidates and such, it's probably going to be alkalosis and hypothermia. all right? And that's a leftward shift, and what that means is your pulse oximetry value will be great because oxygen doesn't want to jump off. But at the tissue level, they'll still be robbed of oxygen. So you have heart attacks, you're gonna have brain problems, all of that kind of stuff, because the stuff that needs oxygen isn't getting oxygen. Here we go. So, easy.